the cultural particulars of being in Britain. Like, we could really quite play that up. If we were proud of being British and proud of our heritage, we would play that up a bit and make it appealing to those people who liked Harry Potter, basically. And we'd be able to attract talent, entrepreneurialism, things like that. But we just don't do any of that. We're not proud of any of our achievements. We're not proud of our history. We're not proud of ourselves. And we're just in this unbelievable slump at the moment. I just can't get over why we're just allowing this to happen. It's not necessary, but the decline is a choice.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I would like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. I am once again in my home country of the UK. So whenever I'm in the UK, I need to talk to this man because he is a brilliant mind and he is definitely representing the UK. And this is Carl Benjamin.
Thank you very much. That was a very kind interview.
No doubt,
intro. I'm really well, even though the country's falling apart. I'm doing great, so that's good in a way.
When you say the country's falling apart, what do you mean?
Oh, it really is. Take a walk down the average high street in the country and you'll notice that half the shops are boarded up and the other half are Turkish barbers and vape shops. The town centres of this country are just decaying, just actively decaying. Everything looks like it's getting worse and everyone feels it, I think.
You're born and raised in the UK.
Yes, right? I was born in the UK. When I was 3, my dad was in the RAF, so we spent. I remember. I spent a total of 8 years living on British camps in Germany, but then came back to the UK when I was 17, I think. But we were back and forth basically. So for the first 3 years of my life in the UK, then 3 years out in Germany, then 10 years back in the UK, then 5 years back in Germany, then back. But the thing is, you're not really living in Germany when you're living on the British camp in Germany. Everything's in English. We use pounds. Or do we use pounds? No, I think we use marks actually. Just convenience. But it looks like a part of England has been transplanted into Germany, and it's run by English law and things like that. So it's a proper colony. It's out there, and that's one of the reasons I'm so concerned about mass immigration now, is because you can see colonies springing up in England of foreign cultures, and I recognise it when I see it. So it really bothers me. We're allowing this to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is an issue that you've been concerned about for ever since you came into the public eye as Sargon Avocad with the YouTube channel, and it seems like the trajectory is just continuing in the same direction. And it's not just you. I find that so many people in this nation, from family members to friends to acquaintances. Firstly, I know a lot of people who have left in the past 5 years or so, including myself. I left 3 years ago. And more people that I know are planning to leave. Some are planning to stay. But it feels like a massive shame because for so much of history, I mean, the UK or its separate entities, England, Scotland, these are countries with a massive history. And the UK has always been one of those countries, for at least during our lives, and certainly before it, where so many people from around the world have moved here and want to move here. And obviously still a lot of people do want to move here. But at the same time, there's this decay. And there's this widespread pessimism where people feel like the future is going to be worse than the present and the past. So, number one, what does that look like? And number two, what can be done about it?
That's a big question. Well, it looks like what we're experiencing now. It looks like people who are capable, upwardly mobile, intelligent, good earners leaving. We get hundreds of millionaires leaving the UK every year. I
saw 15,000 predicted to leave this year. 15,000 millionaires.
This year?
15,000.
I didn't realise it was that high. I knew it was high, but I didn't realise it was that high. Yep. Oh, God. And so that in and of itself is terrible. But then we have what is essentially a socialist government in the Labour Party. And so they look on enviously at anyone who has success and wealth and want to tax them into oblivion, thinking that they're going to be able to pay for the public spending programs that we are saddled with and are not allowed to challenge. You'll notice that whenever they say, there's a huge hole in the finances, they never say, that means we're going to spend less. That means we're going to tax more because we have to pay for all of these things. And it's bankrupting us. It's driving the country into a hole. And Britain, since the latter half of the 20th century, with the loss of the empire, has never really spent any time self-reflecting or coming to terms with what that means. And so we've tried to maintain ourselves at the very head of global affairs as if we were still a great empire, but we're not. And you see this all the time. You see the people in public life saying, well, we're going to be number one in the world in this, we're going to be number one in the world in that, we're going to be a charity superpower or whatever nonsense. And all of this is post-imperial thinking. Like, this is what we used to say when we had the largest navy on Earth. This is what we used to say when we had the largest GDP on Earth. When a quarter of the world was subject to us in some way. It isn't really what the island of Great Britain should be thinking about now we've gracefully let the empire go. We should be thinking, how can we make our world around us better? But instead, the UK government's the institutions are the same institutions from the British Empire. There was never a break between them and a new order. So, when an empire falls, usually it's through violence. Usually it's in chaos. But the British Empire had a very soft landing. And so there's a continuity of the institutions and therefore the sort of thought patterns of the people that occupy them. And so they still view the population as, well, okay, we need workers. Well, we'll just get workers from various African or Middle Eastern or East Asian countries, and we'll just import them in like they used to do when they controlled the empire. I mean, for example, the Rohingya in Burma, they are a product of saying, well, we need labourers in Burma under the British imperial administration. And so they just took a load of Bangladeshis and moved them over, something like 300,000 Bangladeshis, and moved them over to Burma. And under the imperial administration, okay, there's not a lot the Burmese can do about that. But now the Burmese are independent. Well, they're like, why are these Bangladeshis in our country? Why this was done to us? We didn't consent to it. So they want to send them back, basically. And so the British state just says, well, we'll just get doctors and nurses from all over the world. It's like, hey, why wouldn't we train our own? Well, it's easier, it's cheaper to just let them in, right? They don't have to do anything. And so they still look at the world as just a selection of human resources, like every empire does. Every empire looks at the world as areas of human resources that can be purposed for the good of the empire itself, the state, rather than what is actually good for the people themselves. And so this has left us saddled with a backwards way of looking at the world. And since World War II, liberal ideology has become the dominant ideology of the West completely. And this acts as a kind of magic spell that comes down in front of their eyes, and all they see is numbers. So they can't tell any qualitative difference between kinds of people. They can only see quantity. And so they say, well, we'll just get 500,000 people from here, from India, from Pakistan, from Africa, wherever, and we'll just bring them to England, and they'll just be like everyone else because people are just people. They'll do work, and that's great. But the thing is, that's not true. The Danes are the only people in the West that actually keep good stats on this, and they've found that essentially immigrants who don't come from China or Europe or the English-speaking areas of America, like the Anglosphere, they're not net tax contributors, so they never actually pay for themselves, and so we've brought in millions and millions of these people who are now actually a burden economically on our country, and we keep bringing them in more and more and more. And unsurprisingly, we are sinking down and we're becoming poorer and poorer. And no one in power wants to admit that that's the case, because that opens up a whole can of worms. Like, okay, well, what do you do about that? Well, stop bringing them in. So yeah, but if we discriminate between that group of people and that group of people, then we're racist. It's like, okay, then we'll just bankrupt ourselves, shall we?
Yeah. Man, there's so many.
I know there's a lot there, but
yeah, there is a lot.
That's
there.
basically what's happened.
I know that years ago, for sure. I know that you used to call yourself a classical liberal.
Yeah.
Do you still consider yourself that, or do you think you've moved more conservative?
I'm definitely a conservative now. Okay. I used to be a classical liberal because I didn't know that much about politics or philosophy. Then I got involved in all of this and thought, right, I really should get to the bottom of this. So I did a degree in philosophy, and part of a modern degree in philosophy in the English-speaking world, or a large part of it, is liberalism. Because liberalism is it's like Sharia law for the English-speaking world. Right? I'm not joking.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Sharia law is like the law of the Arabs, right? Every Arab instinctively kind of believes in Sharia in some way because they've grown up with it. It's a part of their religion. It's part of their sort of moral code in their day-to-day life. It's probably not, if it's not the exact formal legal code of their country's laws are going to be in some way inspired by the spirit of this. Liberalism is like that for the English-speaking world because liberalism comes out of England, and so it's based on the way that the English do things, the way they politically behave, and the way they see themselves and think the world should be properly ordered. And that's okay when it's restrained in a sort of context. So it's like, well, you know, we would like it that we had individual rights and personal freedoms and the government not interfering, etc., etc., etc. But there's always the sort of like fuzzy limits of where that is. And so, you know, okay, what it means, you know, is freedom to not be arbitrarily arrested by the state or something like that, which makes perfect sense. But when you abstract that away from the English tradition and turn it into a doctrine, like Sharia law is a doctrine that's drawn from the Quran, if you turn it into a doctrine that's drawn from like John Locke or Rousseau or whoever, then you get hard edges to it, where it's, oh no, we have to be free in all circumstances, and anything that infringes on the freedom is immoral, even if it's necessary. So, for example, the freedom to, say, transition is perhaps not something we should extend to children, but the doctrinaire liberal says, well, no, infringing on freedom is always bad, because I hold this as an abstract principle now. I'm not using it in normal daily life for sensible political ends. And so I'm in favour of transitioning children because I'm the doctrinaire liberal. So a normal person who is also in favour of freedom, obviously everyone's in favour of freedom to some degree, looks at that and says, yeah, but there has to be a practical limit to that. But the reason that we keep losing the argument is because the term freedom can be expanded, and we also believe it. We believe that personal freedom is essentially, like I said, like the highest law of the Anglo world. And so it applies to us in the same way that like Sharia law applies to the Arabs. And you can see the extremities of that being taken, like in the Taliban, you know, banning women from being able to speak in public and things like that. I'm sure most of the Arabic world doesn't actually agree with that. But they're going to have a hard time arguing it on a sort of Quranic basis with the Taliban, because in a way they do fundamentally believe that, yes, women need to cover up and not be the main aspect of public life or something like that. And the liberal world, the English-speaking world, has the same problem with liberalism. It's kind of a part of our souls, and when it's taken into a doctrine and rigidly applied, you get very unfavourable outcomes.
It's a sort of, I consider it a soft and weak underbelly of Western society.
It does manifest like that, that's correct.
Because there have to be borders in every sense. And when you have just unrestricted liberalism or unrestricted, you can even say liberty or freedom without checks and balances, whether that is from some combination of faith, family, laws, social codes, taboos, all of these types of things that societies always have, especially when you have people who are not on the same page sort of in any regard. You're just bringing in people from everywhere. And even the people who are native to the country are increasingly polarized and believe very different things, then it sort of just becomes a free-for-all. And something that I think is inevitably going to happen, if that is allowed to continue for many decades, is something stronger and more rigid will come in to take its place. Because if you have an ideology or a belief system or a movement which is more authoritarian and strong and willing to say yes and no and stand on certain things, and then its opposing force is, hey, do whatever you want as long as it's consensual, and hey, just like, you know, laissez-faire.
Yeah.
That stronger one is eventually going to dominate. That just seems obviously inevitable to me.
You know, in that circumstance, I would agree, but actually liberalism isn't quite as laissez-faire as you think.
Okay, explain.
It's just, it operates along lines that are unexpected, right? There's no amount of acceptable racism in liberalism, right? So even if you had a consenting party who was like, yeah, I find it funny when someone's racist to me or something like that, say Keir Starmer or any agents of the state, they don't care. The racism itself is a hard line that they will impose upon you, and lock you up for. They will actually, I mean, it's illegal basically, and they will actually do that, even though in any other framework.
Is that liberal, though?
Oh, 100%. Because concerns about racism themselves are liberal, right? Because the way that liberalism constructs itself, it begins with 17th century English philosophers who didn't really have any experience of non-European people, and so they didn't really know like the depth of difference in different civilizations, right? Now this, I'm not saying this is a racial thing, although there may well be a racial component to it, but that's not really the important thing, because it's really about how people are raised, right? The civilization in which you're raised informs the values you have, the habits you have, the language you use, and there's differences in thought patterns between like the French, the Germans, and the English. Like the French and the Germans, their sentences are entirely back to front compared to ours. German especially, and German with like the strange conjugation of words. Well, that affects the kind of things you can think, right? That's the way you construct a thought is affected by the language you use. And so these differences are very, very deep and are just, they're not irrelevant in any way, shape or form. They really matter. But the philosophers of like the 17th century were trying to come to a rational reason why people lived in society and had the rules that they had. And so they began by assuming that at some point man lived outside of society and had chosen to move into society through a rational deliberation with his fellow man in the primordial woods of the distant past. And therefore a rational series of laws and rules could be instituted that they would call the social contract. Now this just isn't true. Man has never been a solitary animal. We've always, chimpanzees, monkeys, they all still live in groups. Man has always lived in groups. So we've never had a social contract. Nothing like that has ever happened. And so what this means is that when they say, well, if man lived outside of society, there are lots of aspects of man that you can ascribe to society. Like your language, your dress habits, the food you like to eat, the fact that you're overweight. A lot of these things are the product of the society. So if we strip that all away, then hypothetically we have a kind of universal basic human template that we can then say this is man, humanity in its most unvarnished form. That's not really true, but that's what the liberals all believe, whether they understand it or not, because they view man as a universal entity, whereas man is actually a very particular entity. Because no human being is ever born outside of their social context. So whatever society you're born into, you bear the sort of birthmarks and the hallmarks of that society. So you have the customs, you have the values, the emotional set that comes with it. And it, we see this in dispositions. Like the French people are a lot more emotionally disposed than the English being famously reserved. But genetically, there's really not much in it between a French person and an Englishman. It's because they're born in social contexts and these form your character as you grow up and they affect everyone in the society. But the liberal believes that can be ignored because fundamentally they are all human. It's like, yes, that's true. But then this means that the liberal is really unable to admit that the differences could be so great between cultures as to not admit one to belong with the other. So this is kind of how we've arrived at this place, basically.
Are progressives liberals?
Yes. And they're trying to get to the liberal utopia, which the liberal utopia, and all communists are trying to arrive at this utopia as well. You'll notice that the liberals always side with the communists, right? They always side with, because the liberal project arrives at a position where it says, well, look, we've got a rationally constructed state where we've treated everyone as a citizen in the state, and we can essentially do what we want, and we can ban racism, we can ban... And so this is getting back to the racism thing just very quickly, this is the very problem with racism the liberals have, is that if you belong to a race, well, you aren't a universal human being, right? And so any distinction between humans is essentially immoral because it's fundamentally illiberal.
I get what you're saying. The reason I asked that question is because the modern Western progressives, for the past, 20 years or so, they've essentially been pushing what I would argue is some form of racial essentialism, where by me being a black man or you being a white person, like this says a lot about us, and this defines many things about us, which I would say on that I feel like I'm more liberal than them in that regard, where I would say, okay, the fact that you're a white man or I'm a black man, I would argue that doesn't mean nothing. It certainly says something about our ancestors and things like that. But I would say, if you were to someone were to make sort of moral or character judgments or even experience judgments, right? Say, oh well, therefore you're in some position of power and privilege, and I'm oppressed, and society's against me. I'd be like, you're jumping to a lot of conclusions right there. But they seem to heavily be pushing that, which is why I ask around what they really believe.
The reason that they're like this is because what they're trying to do is compensate for what they believe are inherent instructional injustices that are based on prejudice. They believe that they recognize that people have different skin colors and things like that, but they believe that the person themselves is kind of trapped in society. And in a way, they're kind of right about that, right? You don't have a choice about the society you're born into, so you don't really have a choice about the kind of life that you grow up into until you're an adult. And what they're trying to do there is mitigate the differences. So they want to make sure that, okay, well, yes, society recognizes the difference between a black man and a white man, even if it's not legally instantiated. The laws would never differentiate based on our skin colors, right? So that's not the issue. It's the personal prejudices of the people that they think are manifest as unconscious biases, and maybe they do. Maybe they're right.
It just seems
right?
it's.
Well, hang on. No.
Oh,
so
sorry.
What they do? They would, in the ideal world, never talk about skin color, but they know that people are from places and times, from different collections of people, what they would call races, but what other people might call ethnic groups or a people, because when people say race, it seems very biologically essentialist, and that's not really what I think most people mean, but it's also not really what they mean either, because they are blank slaters. They believe that a human being is a pure blank slate and is purely impressed upon by society. And so what they're trying to do, they think, right, okay, all humans were equal and free before we came into society. So there was no real substantive difference between any kind of human. And so the reason they care so much about race is because they view it as a primary vector of inequality, and they're trying to arrive at a position of absolute equality. And so this means, okay, well, look, if black people are getting less and white people are getting more, then we have to discriminate based on race in the service of being against racism. I'm not saying it's without contradiction. I'm not saying I agree with it either, which is obviously I totally disagree with it. But this is how they justify it to themselves. And they are trying to get to the point where they can say, yeah, there's no difference in society between a black person and a white person. That's because they want to arrive back at that state of nature. Again, whether they even understand this or not, most of them don't understand this, because you've got to read the original text to understand why any of this is happening in the first place.
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm sure it sounds like you've thought about this far more than they have.
Oh, I had to do a degree in it, and I was just like, well, this is what stopped me being a liberal. I was like, okay, this is all nonsense. This is all nonsense,
Yeah.
Because the other way of doing things is the sort of, and this is a word they stigmatize a lot, but the sort of tribal way of doing things, where groups of people are stereotypical, and we know that they are stereotypical. I mean, you've traveled a lot. I bet you've encountered a lot of different people who really embody stereotypes.
For sure.
But then you get like a relation between the stereotypes that people kind of lean into. And I lived in Germany for 8 years. There are lots of stereotypes that the Germans have about the English, and that the English have about the Germans that are true. But what this does is it makes us predictable to one another. Actually, I know what a German's going to be like when I talk to them, and a German knows what an Englishman's going to be like when he talks to them. And so actually you can form a relationship with people you don't even know based on the fact that there's a predictable quality about you that they can engage with. And so it allows groups of people to actually get along without being enemies and without having the heavy hand of the state over it. But the problem that the liberal has is what you're saying is, oh, people all belong to a race. It's like, yep. In a way, what we would say an ethnic group or a group of people. The liberal would say, yeah, but that in and of itself is racist. Because you are, a racist is someone who believes that people belong to groups, and therefore you are essentially committing the biggest heresy against liberalism that there is to commit, which is saying a man is not a universal human type. Because you'll notice that all the liberals want universal, equal rights, equal this, universal everything. Because they're trying to erase the differences between the groups. But no one was ever born outside of a group. Everyone is always part of a group. And in the normal historical way of doing things, we just had stereotypes and banter and ways of, understanding, the French are just like that, the Germans are just like that. But the liberal wants to put an end to all of that because, as you said, people are different. It is true that individuals aren't only a product of their group. There is more to an individual, and you can't predict what a person's actual life actually was. You can only have a sort of rough heuristic from taking a look at someone. If I see someone dressed in a stripy shirt with a baguette, I'm going to guess he's a Frenchman. He might be a Dutchman on his way to a fancy dress party or something. Right? I don't know. It's a guess. But the point is that by them be considered racism. So the way that different groups of people got along without violence in the past is stigmatized by the liberal. And so the liberal is at war with almost all human experience all the time. And that's why they act in the way they do.
Yeah. It's really interesting because in this modern era that we're living in, I often feel like when it comes to, people use words in different ways, including liberal and conservative, but in many aspects, I find, generally speaking, conservatives to be more liberal than many people who call themselves liberal.
That's true.
In the sense that they are less likely to run with some of these stereotypes or to make some of these assumptions off of immutable characteristics and to treat people more truly as individuals, which seem to be the liberal claims and goals. But in reality, I've experienced this my entire life before I was even remotely politically interested in any type of way. I mean, I went to boarding school in the UK from the age of 11 for 7 years. And then I went to university here for 3 years. And, in my school, I was one of few black kids. I was, used to I'm used to being a minority in many ways.
Yeah.
And it was, very rarely ever an issue. And when I think of my own experiences and conversations I've had with people, again, generally speaking, people who are more like conservative leaning, it rarely even comes up. Like the fact that I'm black or that I'm Nigerian background or Igbo background, like I'm kind of just Zuby to them.
Yeah.
And then it's always been people who more call themselves liberal or maybe explicitly progressive, where the conversation somehow always comes back to the fact that I am a black man in society, kind of thing. And
you know what? I've always noticed it always comes up when we talk, but it only ever comes up in relation to how
that's what I mean. And that's been my experience over decades. And I'm sure it's different for different people, but I generally find that
I only get to talk about being a white man whenever I'm talking to a leftist.
Yeah, this is what I mean. This is what I mean. Yeah. Like in a normal everyday conversation, I'm connected to so many people, and I don't know if this makes me a liberal, but I would never call myself that. but I genuinely don't like people's color or ethnicity or it's so irrelevant to me. Like all of the people I associate with or I'm friends with, I really see content of character. I see people's morality, their behavior, how they treat me, how they treat other people. I'm not going to take a scumbag side because he's black.
Yeah.
Or defend what you say.
There's
people who will.
Yeah, 100%,
right?
Yeah.
There's people who will. It's like, oh no, I need to stand. That's my group. I need to defend the back. I'm like, no, that's awful. I'm not gonna, and I'm not going to oppose someone because that guy's white or he's Jewish or he's is he a good dude? Is he cool? That's really what I care about. And I get people who try to more online, but they try to get you into these debates. They try to push it on you, right? It's like, I've seen, how come Zuby doesn't talk more about the Jews or whatever? I'm like, and say what?
Yeah.
Same reason I don't talk about the Hindus or I don't talk about the whites or the Muslims. What does that even mean? I'm just it's such an odd thing, but there's people are they very much see the world just stratified. There's a right-wing version and a left-wing version of this, but they see it very stratified.
100%. But if you notice the way that you were constructing the differences in thought, right? The left have abstract categorical thought. So they take an attribute that they've decided this is the attribute we care about, and now all of those things are in this category. But that means that no one instance of that thing is actually very important. It's not, this black person. It's a black person. And that means it's every black person. Again, you see the universalism in their own thought. There's a universal black type as far as they're concerned. There's a universal human type because they're constantly trying to get back to the abstract, oh, we're all just one race, the human race is just human. That's it. But what the problem with what you do when you abstract into a category, whatever you want to base it upon, is that like I said, like every instance of it is as satisfactory as any other instance of it. So, okay, if we've got Martin Luther King or something, whoever you want to choose is like the black exemplar, well, he's just as valid as the worst murderer in the world, as long as that guy's skin color is the same. Because it's just the abstract, it's a very thin way of judging anything. And like you say, they're trying to drag you into a category with a bunch of people you're not involved with at all. I don't know those people. I don't want to have any, but because you are thinking through a relational lens. So this is the total opposite of the abstract categorical view, where anyone can be interchanged with anything else. For you, a person is a unique, not perfect, but a unique special individual who exists here and now and will never exist again, right? There'll never be another Zuby, there'll never be another Carl, there'll never be another, like your dad, your mum. And so these people are all connected because you know them. And so the way that you're related to them is not just sort of on a familial or interpersonal level, but it's a moral level. You've got a moral connection with that person where you think, oh no, that's a good judge of character. That's a decent person that I can trust, I can rely on, and they think one of me, I think one of them. And so there's this kind of like psychic link that keeps you things together. And then you think about, okay, well that's you and that one person, but that person has it with everyone else around them. And so you see this web of interconnected people who all judge each other based on whether they care about each other, whether they like each other. And people who hate each other, who have got a relationship as well, but that's the sort of, if all of these other relationships are kind of like, a warm blue color, well, this is a stark red color, oh no, so-and-so's walked in the room, oh, we're going to have a bloody argument with that guy and that guy now, because you already knew what their relationship was like. They're not interchangeable. It could be, if anyone else had walked in the room, that guy wouldn't have that problem with that other guy, because they're not interchangeable, fungible categories. They're unique, basically mythological people. Like, it's like you're living through your own personal Iliad. Oh no, it's going to be Achilles that kills Hector. The gods have ordained it this way. It's going to be that because Achilles and Hector have a relationship. No one is an interchangeable, fungible category. People are unique, and that's the difference in the worldview. And so that's why, in a way, you're more liberal. Well, like,
I think it's...
let me rephrase that. I don't want to say more liberal, because the liberal change... You treat people better and in a more fair way because you are assessing the individual before you. And if the individual before you, even if he comes from a particularly bad stereotype, if he is not doing any of the stereotypical things and acts in a very good way, then you judge him on that merit. Whereas the liberal would say, well, look, he's far right. I'm going to treat him like a piece of it. I've put him in a category, and every instance of that category is the same and interchangeable. So it doesn't matter how good this person is. I've decided he's far right, he's white, he's male, he's straight, whatever the problems are, whatever the problem categories for the liberal, I'm going to treat you all as if you're all as guilty as the worst example of it. And that's the main difference in worldviews.
Yeah, it flattens individuals, and it's I think it's a very anti-Christian worldview as well. Actually,
100%.
It's because I'm not a liberal. I'm Christian, and the way I view people is totally in line with that.
I was accurately describing the way you look at people, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Because I feel the same way. That's how I describe people.
Yeah, and then it's how we're supposed to.
I agree.
Yeah,
I totally. This is why I stopped calling myself a liberal. I was like, oh, I realize how the liberals, because it's hard to think of these things. Hard to think these things through. Most people wouldn't even bother. Why would you think about it? But it's only because I spent so many years studying. I was just like, oh yeah, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to think of people like that, because that genuinely does prejudice you against people. So that's why I stopped being a liberal. Basically.
Yeah, I get that. I think something that happens, and maybe why some people have this instinct, is because firstly, I think a lot of people are just very binary thinkers. Yeah. So they think it's either this extreme or it's that extreme. Yeah. And I think a lot of people sort of struggle with the idea that that two things can be true at once. Okay, so it can be true that people's background and ethnicity and class and nationality and ancestral history, all of these things play some type of role in our personalities and our belief systems and our cultures and so on. But it doesn't mean that it's the be all and end all. It doesn't just mean, oh, this person is from here, or is this shade of color, or his parents are from here. So it means all of these things. It's like, yes, there's, I think you have people who they want to jump to the extreme of like race or ethnicity or culture or class or everything. And they see everything through, working class versus middle class versus upper class, where they see everything as, black, white, Asian, like the racial categories, or they see everything as, even, it could even be gender, right? Male and female, and, it's just hard way this way, hard that way. And it's like, yeah, it's like there are differences in all of these things, and that's fine. And we shouldn't pretend it doesn't exist, right? It's like that term colorblind is an interesting one, because I know what it hints at, but it's not meant. I don't think it's intended to be taken literally, as in like,
no, of course
walk around and you literally can't tell what people look like or anything like. It's like, yeah, you can see that, but that shouldn't determine how you treat people, or like. Well, there's just a balance that seems to be sort of missing in the public consciousness here, even though it seems rather obvious.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Like the phrase, the sort of colorblindness is the sort of right-wing liberalism. There are two types of liberalism, basically, because there's a kind of negative. They call it negative and positive liberalism.
Okay.
So negative liberalism is freedom from interference. So the state or whoever doesn't interfere with your life. So essentially, it's the kind of life you could lead if you washed up on a desert island.
Yes.
They're your basic rights and freedoms.
American style.
And American style, yeah. They're the sort of English liberalism. And most people would just instinctively agree with them because, well, why not? It makes perfect sense. But then you've got the sort of French liberalism that says, well, yeah, okay, but you're not living in the state of nature. You actually are entitled to positive freedoms, as in, the way that, say, Jean-Jacques Rousseau characterizes it is that nature provided the bounty for mankind. And so if anyone has property, then what they've done is, and he's, in the social contract, there's a particular paragraph where he says the real person who brought about inequality in the world was that person who first staked out a plot of land and said, this is mine, right? And he laments, what should have happened at the time is everyone should have ripped it up and cast him out and said, no, this will never happen. Because the very, very left-wing liberals are following the same morals as communists, because communists are just disappointed liberals who say, well, look, you had this wonderful vision of essentially the human race returning to a Garden of Eden, where we'd just be picking fruits off the trees and sleeping under the boughs of, in the leaves and things like this. And this is obviously a nonsense fantasy. And where the sort of the English-speaking world got to be like, okay, well, not being screwed over by the government is good enough for me. The more progressive side is like, okay, but why is anyone going hungry? Why is anyone going without shelter? Nature would have provided these, is what they are essentially calling upon. And so now the state has to take the place of nature and provide a bunch of positive rights. This is destroying us. This creates a series of commitments we can't afford, and is essentially what the goal of communism is. Because if you think about communism, every communist is really saying the same thing as the liberals. They're like, yeah, no, we want everyone to be housed and fed and sheltered and clothed and to have every individual right to the most maximal extent. So no person is ever reliant on another person. And again, that comes straight from Rousseau. And it's echoed by Marx, it's echoed by, every communist who comes afterwards. They don't want people to be dependent on one another. They want them to be dependent on nature. And the state has to take the place of nature to provide everything that nature would have provided. It's bonkers. And the thing is, the communists are actually more honest in this formulation, if you think about it, because one of the things that the liberals pointed out is that, well, one of the reasons man came into society is to protect his property. So a man carved himself a log cabin or something. Okay, well, if he wanders off to go hunting, then someone else can just take it or destroy it or something like that. So you come together and say, well, look, we're going to set up a government, so the government protects our property. That's great. And then the liberal says, well, or the communist says, well, yeah, but you aren't in the state of nature if you have property. You promised us perfect freedom and perfect liberty and perfect equality, because that's what every man had when he was just wandering around on his own in the woods. They're all the same, and they're all completely free. And some of you are free, but others are not equal because some have property and others don't. And so the root of communism is just to try and get back to this state of nature where nobody has any differences. That means nobody has any property, because property is the root of inequality. And so they're not following a different pattern. The communists are just further down the line than the average liberal is. And this is why communism always dogs liberalism. Like, you never see actually that fascism dogs liberalism, because fascism is a divergence into something else completely. You know, but the communists and the liberals all basically agree on the same principles. And the communists are just like, come on then, trying to drag the liberals further and further and further. And so this is going to be a perennial problem with liberalism.
So we've talked about liberalism and even touched on communism. So what even is conservatism? And what's it seeking to conserve?
Well, that's the problem with conservatism, is it's the right wing of liberalism. So the terms left and right and the concept of conservatism were never necessary outside of the paradigm of progress. And progress is the drive to get to the liberal ideal, which is us returning to the Garden of Eden, essentially. And the conservative is the person who says, yes, but. And the but is always, yes, that would be nice, but if we get there, damage is going to be done along the way. So we want to drive the speed limit, as Michael Malice puts it. We don't want to go too fast, because you might hurt a lot of people, ruin a lot of good things that we have in the desire to get to the end state. And so the conservative is someone who consents to everything the liberal wants, but just wants to go a bit slower. And so when I say conservative, I do it just to make it easier for people to understand that I'm on the right rather than in favour of being on the right rather than on the left. But in reality, I don't really know what you would call someone who's not in favour of getting to that end state. Right? These days I call myself a traditionalist.
Yeah, I was going to say traditionalist.
Because I'm just in favour of a traditional society where we're kind of in our tribes, we live harmoniously with each other, we have families, relationships, we are part of our local communities, and these are all the things that liberalism attacks. You'll notice that everything liberalism attacks is the relationship between someone and something else, right? I mean, this is why they think that children are not owned by their parents, they're owned by the state. And if you think about it, well, no, what claim does the government have to my children? Right? Then, I mean, literally the words we use, they're my children. I'm their father. I belong to them as much as they belong to me, But the government will come in and say, no, we've decided for whatever reason we're going to take these away now. And they have the power to do it. And this is why the consent is the primary factor in liberal morality, and it interferes with many of our relationships. Because if you think about a lot of your relationships, they weren't consensual. You actually didn't choose a lot of your relationships. You had them put upon you, but that doesn't mean they're not good.
Certainly for the first couple
of decades of your life.
Yeah.
Right. But the state the liberal is constantly. I mean, you see it with politics all the time, where people on the left will denounce their own family members, and it's just like RFK had this recently, where he was like, "Look, I think it's got to be Trump because I don't like the Democrats where they're going." Suddenly, his family members are denouncing him. It's like, think of your relationship. You've known him your entire life. Party first. And it should be relationships first. The way that you treat your family, your friends, the people, your neighbors, these are all your relationships, and they are the most important thing about your life. The entire good of human life comes from the quality of your relationships. If you don't have good relationships with the people around you, you have a miserable life. And that's why the left are such miserable shits. They really are, though, aren't they?
It's true.
They're all on antidepressants because their relationships are bad. It's because they lent into liberalism so heavily that they damaged all of their relationships because of a very abstract political ideal that can never be brought about.
Yeah. Why do you think that Western countries in particular have been so susceptible to this over the last few decades? Because I often make the point that most people in the world are conservative or traditionalist. That's actually the human norm on a global scale. And it seems like countries in the Anglosphere and Western Europe, which is probably only about 1 billion people, we seem to be particularly susceptible to what's the right term? The excesses and the sort of cultural suicidal aspects, suicidal empathy of this sort of extreme, what I would argue is a kind of extreme form of liberalism or progressivism, where people in the government and even individuals are willing to put willing to put, illegal immigrants over a native population, or willing to put the rights of criminals over the rights of the people they victimize.
The rights of men over women in women's spaces.
Exactly. There's this constant inversion going on. And then I look at other parts of the world, and it's funny, quite literally yesterday I was having dinner with my parents and some of my an aunt and uncle who are visiting from Nigeria. So everyone in this conversation, I believe, is 70 plus.
Right. And
I don't know how we got onto the conversation, but I was explaining, we ended up explaining the concept of pronouns, like they, them pronouns, non-binary to my mom's older brother, who's in his 70s, and he never
70-year-old Nigerian man
lives in northern Nigeria.
What are you talking about?
He was like, but for a single person, like they he was confused. He was like, you say they is or they we like, and his mind is the confusion in his face is just like, what on earth even like what even is this? And that would be the response to most people around the world on many of these issues. They're just like, what even are you talking about? So I'm just wondering, like, what's going on in the West? Like, how is this happening?
So I think it's because it's our tradition is liberalism, but we never called it that, right? So you can see the sort of genesis of this in, really deep back in the history of the English in particular, with things like Magna Carta, because what liberalism is the universalization of the rights of Englishmen. So the English were quite lucky in a way that after the Norman conquest, so nearly 1,000 years now, England hasn't been conquered by a foreign power. And so we haven't had to think of ourselves as being a people under the yoke of another people. Because that when that happens to a people, they get a very firm sense of their shared identity. It's like the Jewish people in particular have a very strong sense of this because of the 2,000 years. So they understand themselves as being part of a sort of collective entity. But England's been a very safe place politically for the English. And so the concerns were not external because the enemies never really came close to taking England. So it became very internal. So it was oppression from the king was way more important, especially as the Normans were originally Vikings that had become Francoized, or however you describe it, become French. And then they brought a different kind of legal system to England, which had its own very tribal series of laws and relationships prior to that. And so the Magna Carta is a part of a sort of 200-year trek that the English people had to restrain the power of the king. Because the French have absolute monarchs, and this is the doctrine of absolute monarchy, really reaches a zenith under Louis XIV, who just comes out and says that I am the state. I am, and he has his palace in Versailles, and he has every noble in the country. Well, in the English-speaking world, it wasn't like that. The sort of Germanic tribes had restricted kingships. The king was not an absolute dictator of the country. The people themselves had rights. And this was preserved in England, probably because of its isolation and safety. And it becomes, through the medieval era, the rights of Englishmen. And the rights of Englishmen seem like a really good idea. The king can't just take your property. He can't come into your house. The king can't just arbitrarily arrest you. And if he does, you've got a right called habeas corpus that you can exercise against him, that the society itself will support you in because you were an Englishman. And so
but what if you posted a mean tweet?
Well, that's a great question. You'll notice that we don't have the rights of Englishmen anymore. We have human rights. And it was John Locke, the English liberal philosopher, who decided, well, these are just intrinsic rights of humans, right? So the English had spent, 500 years, however long, actually, fighting the government, having revolts, civil wars, to physically impose upon the sovereign the fact that we as Englishmen are not going to accept that anything less than this suite of rights. You are going to treat us in this particular way, and in turn we'll pay our taxes, we'll join your army, and we won't cause trouble, right? Now, this was abstracted by John Locke into being the rights of man. So if all men are the same, again, liberal philosopher, blank slate philosopher, if all men are the same, then all men must have the same rights. And that sounds like a good idea, but it turns out that the rights of Englishmen, they're parochial. They belong to an ethnic group, the English. They don't belong to the Irish, they don't belong to the French. And so these are based, and because of the long history of England, there's a series of like social institutions and political institutions that are geared around accepting this. These are in the law. These are things that are in the law. Like you've got 18th century jurists, like who was it? Was it Blackstone or Dicey who finally properly codified the rights of Englishmen and gave them the sort of real hard edge of law that they had always just informally had. And so you've got a series of institutions, and the society understands this is how we're going to operate. Well, if you take that away, then you say, right, I've got a doctrine of human rights now. So then if you apply that to another country, you say, well, this country isn't supporting the rights of Englishmen. It's like, well, no, in France, they weren't supporting the rights of Englishmen. That's true. Well, that means it all has to change. And so you have the French Revolution as a product of importing English rights into France, into what was feudal France, or the old regime it was called. And so they found, well, Frenchmen don't have the rights of Englishmen, but we want them to have the rights of Englishmen because the rights of Englishmen are good things. They're very good things to have. And throughout the Middle Ages, England was considered a place that had liberty. It was considered a free and happy country. I mean, they literally called it merry old England. And this is, people at the time literally called it this. And I mean, Rousseau writes about how he's kind of envious of the English. Voltaire is envious of the English because they look at the way that England's governed compared to medieval France. It's night and day. And it's because of the absolute power of the king and the aristocracy, and there's a lot to go into. But when you abstract that, you take away the institutions and the history. You say, well, look, there was a series of steps that the English took to get to that position, and it took 800 years, something like that. And you want it now. You want that now, overnight. It's like, well, that's not something you can just get overnight, at least not without a lot of bloodshed. And so you end up with the terror. You end up with the war in the Vendée. You end up invading various other countries and spreading the abstract ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity to everyone else. And this is a cascade of series of events. But it becomes destructive when it's applied to countries that aren't England. And then it becomes something that they can't let go. Because now, I mean, like millions of people died in the Napoleonic Wars after the French Revolution. Like, we've bought into this with a lot of blood. And if we say, well, maybe it's not actually as good an idea as we think, then we condemn everything that we've done prior in the service of it. And the only reason that all of this is kind of swept aside is because, well, it was for a noble ideal. And it's like, okay, well, what if the ideal wasn't that noble, actually? That means for the last 300 years, everything about the Enlightenment essentially becomes evil. And I don't think anyone's prepared to do that. So, and it's not that everything about it was evil either. It was just a lot of blood has been shed over this. Not necessarily shed either. And it's become essentially our tradition. We can't help but be liberal in many, many ways. We can't bear ourselves to not be the other way, because it opens a Pandora's box about whether we were on the right side of history or not. And it turns out we might not have been. And the average, I mean, you've heard it more than enough times, I'm sure. Oh, I'm a liberal, therefore I'm on the right side of history. But what if you aren't on the right side of history?
Well, that was an awesome history lesson. I actually learned a lot.
Yeah, sorry to go off on one, but
no. I learned a lot from that response because I didn't have a solid grasp of that type of history.
It took me a long time to figure all this out as well.
Well, that was a very good summary. Carl, if you were in power,
oh God,
in the UK,
yeah,
as someone who spends a lot of time thinking and perhaps even lamenting about the state of the UK and the direction it's going in, what would you change or implement?
We're quite far down a rabbit hole at this point, and there's a sort of easy response that people give that won't give easy results. And I think a lot of people feel quite desperate at this point, and so they're happy to go for the quote-unquote solution that would be just get rid of the foreigners, right? A lot of people just think that these days. A lot of English people, just regular English people.
How common do you think that view is?
I'd say probably about 60% of the population.
60%?
Yeah, oh yeah. England's actually a really far-right country, but we're governed... No, it really is. It really is. It's just we're governed very liberally, and because we're patient and polite people, we don't tend to cause a fuss. But I think a lot of people are getting to the point where it's just like, God, why are there so many foreigners here?
And how are foreigners being defined there?
People who are not English, basically.
Okay, ethnically English.
Yeah. But more tribally English. right? Because there are people who are not white or genetically English who are definitely in the tribe, who definitely have relations with people and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily ethnically English; it's more tribally. People like your neighbours. But there are colonies of foreign ethnicities who are not part of the tribe and who were people who were being protested with the Southport riots. This is why they went after a mosque, because the Islamic community doesn't seem to have integrated into the English community. Whereas there are a lot of Caribbean people or whatever who are integrated into the English community because they've got nowhere else to go. They live here and stuff like that. So it's not that people are racist in the sort of way that liberals mean it, but they are kind of tribalist, and they kind of want their friends and their tribesmen to stay, but they want the enemy tribes to go. I wouldn't do anything like that because, you'd be creating a load of injustices. A lot of these people were invited here by the government legally, right? And so it would mean that we would end up essentially disgracing ourselves in the same way that Germany did in World War II. And you don't want that hanging over the head of future generations. Because I say this as someone who lived in Germany for 8 years. One beer in, as an Englishman talking to a German, we're talking about World War II. Yeah. I was 17. I was I don't care about World War II. Why are you talking about it? You weren't there, and I was a liberal at the time, so I was just why are we talking about this? But it's a collective guilt they carry with them. We don't want that. So, but the problem is that England in particular is overpopulated at the moment. There are just too many people here because...
Defined how?
In the last... since 1997... something like 15 million people have settled here. So the population has grown by 15 million. And you see it in the housing market, you see it in the infrastructure, you see it in the fact that wages have been flat. Wages can't grow when there's an influx of foreign labour to compete in the market. There's been a huge amount of social displacement where people just feel like they're losing the country. This is Lee Anderson from Reform's entire thing. I want my country back. They feel that things have got out of control. And so I think the best thing that the first policy that should be taken is to break the lazy dependence on foreign labour, and we've had 25 years of immigration, we don't need any more, right? If 15 million new people doesn't solve whatever problems immigration was supposed to solve, then that's not the solution to it. So I think we should just stop inflowing immigration at this point. And
completely?
Yeah, completely.
No more immigration?
No, we've had 25 years of millions of people who've come in, and it's the system is creaking. The system itself is creaking, and so that just has to stop. It doesn't have to be permanent. It just has to be
a moratorium. Yeah,
a moratorium for as long as it takes for us to get the country back in working order. Because another thing everyone says, well, nothing works. Well, yeah, of course not. Duh. If you increase the number of people living in your house by however many, and they're like, okay, but the toilet isn't flushing. And no, everything's broken because...
You know what's so interesting when you say that?
What?
Is it sounds extreme.
But it's completely sensible.
And it's interesting because I'm in myself, having a quick internal debate there, ooh, that sounds like... My reaction in my brain is, ooh, that sounds extreme. And then I'm thinking, why would a moratorium on immigration be extreme? I'm mulling that over in my own head. Yeah. Perhaps it's because I've never seen a country do it, and immigration, it has just been the norm in almost every country I'm aware of my entire lifetime. They differ in how they do it, and what the restrictions are, and what the requirements are, and the paperwork.
Most countries are much more sensible about it.
Yeah, they are. But a complete moratorium.
Yeah. And the thing is, it doesn't even have to be that hard. Sure. It's just, the way I would sell it is that we're just going to stop because we've had 25 years with 15 million new people here. If whatever problem you were trying to solve isn't solved by that, then that's the wrong approach. Yeah. Now, obviously, if you want to, the thing is, what politicians will say, well, look, we'll just get, doctors and lawyers and nurses. It's okay, but there's still problems with that because what you're doing is saying we don't need to train our own people. So we're denying access to opportunities and careers that British people who've got nowhere else to go were going to rely upon, and you've replaced them with someone else from another country. But also you've deprived that country of their doctors. We've got loads of Indian doctors. Oh yeah, I'm sure India doesn't need them. We've got loads of African nurses. Oh yeah, I'm sure Africa doesn't need them. What are you doing? And this is the sort of imperial mindset where it's just human capital. We'll just bring them in. Yeah. And then you've got the poor people, the white working class in Britain is well known. that they're the ones struggling the most at the moment. It's well known. Well, it's because the career advancements that these training courses would normally have given are just, it's expensive to train them. We can just get a doctor from India for free. We didn't have to pay for that. So, okay, but think about who you're selling out there. You're screwing the Indians who need their doctors. You're screwing the white working class who need their jobs. You're not making, and then you're packing the country with new people. That's, the infrastructure is, the NHS used to work. When I was a kid, the NHS worked. When my dad was a kid, the doctor would come to your house. They would just come to your house because it wasn't an overpopulated country. Now, something like 11, 12% of the entire country are currently on an NHS waiting list. There's something like 8 million people are on waiting lists. And people die because they're not getting cancer treatment, because we're trying to provide an international health service rather than a national one. And it's like, okay, this is crazy. This is just not working. And so I would just stop the inflow, because every year we get like 1.2, 1.4 million people in, and then 800,000 or 700,000 or so people would leave. Because the people who are just here for the services, the benefits, the job, whatever it is, they eventually want to go home to where they feel they belong. And, they're not here to settle forever. And so if we just stop the inflow, there's going to be a kind of outflow, and you'll feel the pressure drain. So, we can breathe again. I can get an NHS appointment again. I can drive on the roads without being in a traffic jam forever again.
So allow the population to naturally decline for some time.
Exactly, right? And so that way, you've not committed any injustices. No one has a right to come to another country. It's always a privilege to move to someone else's country. So you can just say, no, we're not going to let anyone move here. You can still have tourist visas and stuff like that, but you can't move here and become a citizen. Okay, well, fair enough. No one's hurt by that. The people who just want to go will just go because they were going to go anyway. And that will mean the housing market will return to a sensible equilibrium. The jobs market will suddenly become a workers' market rather than a buyer's market. The employers will suddenly have to be, I can't just get a million different job applications. I'll have to make the job more, so it's better for the worker. That means that the people who are going to be doing skilled, necessary labor, like being a nurse, being a doctor, we're going to have to recruit from within a population that had been suppressed for such a long time. And so now it's opportunities for young people to get on the ladder, to get on the housing ladder, to get on the careers ladder, to feel like they belong in their own country and they've got a future in their own country.
So realistically, this is, just that aspect of things realistically would probably be
90% of the problems.
But probably be a couple decades now, right?
Sure. It would take some time. Yeah. I probably a decade, I would say. Okay. You could get the system up and running as it ought to be. But the point is, you didn't have to take any kind of negative action against anyone. You haven't discriminated against anyone either, actually. And you've made sure that there is the prospect of a brighter future in this country. Because at the moment, I'm sure you're aware, everyone's looking at this place like, oh my God, we're going down. This is it. It's unrecoverable. It's not unrecoverable. It's just that the state is doing nothing to recover it. What they're trying to do is maintain the universal liberal world order inside of the country. So they're like, okay, we'll provide a health service. Anyone who arrives in the country can get healthcare on the NHS. Like, are you mad? Anyone can come because anyone can just get a visa because you stamp them like 1 million a year. Like, what are you doing? And so, anyway, that's what I would do. Okay. And then we would fix the problems as they came up on a daily basis. You'd have to,
Any other major policies, or you said you think that was the majority of problems?
I would. So one thing that happened when Tony Blair took over and New Labour in the 90s is they essentially tried to make the British constitutional system more like the European one, and the European one is trying to be more like the American one. So we've got this kind of third-hand bastardization of a foreign culture's government. So, for example, Britain never had a Supreme Court. We got a Supreme Court in 2009. I've got shirts that are older than the Supreme Court. It's just crazy. Like, I've got socks that are older than the Supreme Court. What? And they tried to hold up Brexit. There's no constitutional settlement for us. We don't have a written constitution. So everyone's trying to, okay, well, what's their role exactly? We don't need that. Go, that can go. And I'd basically start undoing almost all of Tony Blair's constitutional reforms, because Britain was perfectly well governed. Like, Britain was a watchword for good governance right up until the late 90s. And then everything went downhill because Tony Blair started messing with the furniture. I'd get rid of all that. I wouldn't have speech crimes. Speech crimes are a terrible idea. They're the sort of thing that tyrannical governments do. I would reduce corporation tax to as low as it can possibly be. Yeah. Like, and I don't just say this because I own a small business. Well, I have to pay 25%. I mean, that's people I could be employing.
For sure.
You know, that's
it was one of the things that pushed me out.
It's crazy.
Additional things, raising it from 19 to 25. I was like, 19 was like
19's bad enough anyway.
25 is like that's a quarter.
Especially when Ireland is 12.5.
Yeah,
they're half of our corporation tax. Like, that's predatory.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing it because, I mean, like, anyone who's got a YouTube channel knows you get paid from Google Ireland.
Yep.
You get paid from Twitter Ireland. You know, because they just sit offshore and it's very easy for them to operate in Britain.
Yeah.
Why do we allow it?
That's one of the craziest and most destructive things I think that's going on in the UK. And I think it's a desperation move where they're trying to just, you know, again, I see trending on X the other day, you know, tax the rich, right?
It's crazy.
Tax the rich, raise corporation taxes. And it's like, you are making this country so hostile for entrepreneurs. You're an entrepreneur.
I am.
I'm an entrepreneur. There are so many brilliant, smart, wealthy people of all ages just fleeing this country.
It's crazy, isn't it?
I'll have to show it to you.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you haven't seen it. There's it was published a few weeks ago, and it's every year.
I did see it. Is it a map of the world?
It's a millionaire migration map.
Yeah, I did see it.
So it's showing the net outflows and inflows of people with $1 million plus net worth, where they're moving to and from. So as I said, the UK is on track to lose 15,000 people of 1 million plus net worth this year. The USA, I think, is gaining about 5,000. I think the UAE is gaining about... No, I think the UAE is gaining even more than America, which is crazy considering the size of the country.
Yeah.
I think about 5,000 moving to the UAE. I think US gain is about 3,000. Australia gains about 3,000. China's losing, I think, 20-something thousand millionaires. So it's just interesting.
We're in the same position
you can
as China.
See, like, so you can see like where the people who have money are going, and a lot of those people will be entrepreneurs. They will be business owners. There will be I doubt actually that much of it is people who have just kind of like old money. I imagine most of them would probably stay. Money. It's mostly people who are. I know so many people who've gone from UK to US, for example. Yeah. When I'm in Dubai,
same I do.
So many 20-something-year-olds, British 20-something-year-olds in Dubai right now.
Yeah,
just moving. So many of them working in real estate, and I talk to them all. I'm like, you know, when did you move here? Most are in the past 2 years.
Yeah.
What made you leave Leeds and go to Dubai? And it was like weather, taxes, being paid more, job opportunities, just and one of the big things is just being somewhere that you can feel the upward trajectory. I feel like I'm somewhere which is going to be better in 5 years.
The spirit of it.
Than worse in 5 years. So with the UK, it's just like, how can that? It's almost like they're. I feel the same with California. It's like it almost feels like they're intentionally doing things that are going to drive away the very people you actually want to stay, who would start things and
the people you want to
tax
and
employ people and. I think there's a real short-sightedness with it all.
100%.
I think people forget sort of what the chain, the downstream chain is. So someone will think, "Oh, Carl's doing well. Let's just tax the crap out of him." Right? They're not
literally Keir Starmer, right?
Yeah, but they're not thinking. Okay, firstly, you have a family. Okay, and as you know, as an entrepreneur, like even when you're making money, I don't even have a family yet, right? But like money can disappear quite
very quickly,
right? Yeah. And you have costs. Yeah. It's not like you're just Mr. CEO of Nike.
Well, they act like you're Scrooge McDuck. You've got a vault of wealth.
Exactly.
It's like, people don't understand. Businesses are not lakes; they're rivers.
Yes.
You know, money comes in and goes out, and it's it's always moving. It's never just sat in your business.
Even the term net worth. Someone hears, "Oh, Elon Musk has $300 million net worth." They think he's got a vault.
Yeah, exactly. They literally do.
A vault with piles of cash in it.
I've seen them literally reference it. Where they're like, "Well, look, a billionaire should never be able to own more than 999 million." It's like you don't understand. It's not liquid money.
No,
it's valuation. Anyway, I'm not going
to. And you're employing people. The people you're employing probably also have families and so on. So it's like, okay, so if you're just like, let's lop off the head, metaphorically, the person at the top who's...
Everything's fine after that.
Okay, now you've just... There might be 50, 100, 1,000 people downstream of that who are now worse off because you thought, oh, well, that guy's rich and he's doing well, so let's come after him. Or he's just like, oh, I'm going to relocate to Texas. Or, I'm going to move to Portugal. I'm going to move to Singapore.
Also, every time you tax me, that's wages I can't pay.
Yes.
So... the fact that I'm 25% down on my on the earnings of the company, well, that's 25% of people who are not employed by me.
Exactly.
Now. There are people that are being disadvantaged by your taxes that I can't even name because they haven't been able to apply for a job I couldn't offer because I was never going to. I can't afford that. Therefore, I'm not going to open up a position to do this or that or the other. There are so many opportunities. The whole thing is so negative. And if it was like, look, if we had zero corporation tax, you just tax the individuals, then you'd probably find that, it would be way more exciting for entrepreneurs to be here.
It would draw people in from other countries.
It would draw investment from other countries.
If you allowed them in.
If you allow, yeah. Well, but the thing is, as well, like it drives me crazy how, like, okay, yeah, we can never fix the weather, but the history of Britain and England, it's essentially, it could be like living in a Harry Potter novel.
Yes.
Like the young millennial types would be like, oh yeah, but I'd really like to live in that cozy civilization that can produce rooms like this.
Great.
It would be. It should be.
The UK is. This is why I get frustrated by what's happening, particularly in the UK and to some degree in the US, because some people think I'm. Why are you critical of the UK or why are you critical?
We deserve it.
I'm like, because but some people miss it. I'm like, because I really love those countries.
Yeah.
And I've traveled to a lot of nations around the world, and I recognize just how fortunate people are from things people don't even consider, even the geography, right? The geography is just like, even just the location and the weather and the ability to reach the east and the west. Do you know one of my favorite things about the UK? And let me not say favorite, but something I really like about the UK that like no one even doesn't even go in people's brains is like the time zone, the GMT time zone.
Yeah.
Right? Being I've been in Australia. It's freaking annoying doing like business or working with anyone anywhere, or even just trying to call your family. Like it's annoying. It's really irritating.
But you're always ahead of the Americans.
Yeah. but you're like way ahead. Or even just being on like, being in like Hawaii time zone. It's so like you're behind everyone by miles, and it's actually really annoying on a day-to-day basis to like to do things. UK is even brilliant for like shipping things. Like you can just, if you're an entrepreneur, you can like ship things all over the world. The cost for me to send a book from the UK to USA costs about £5, £5.50, and it gets there typically within a week or two. For me to send a book from the UK to the US, it costs about $30. The same book.
Well, the other way around, you mean?
The other way around, it costs $30, right?
That's crazy.
And there's just these little things, even like if you're just running a business. I find this now, like I live in Dubai now.
Yeah.
And there are certain things, time zone being one of them, that I'm just like, this is kind of like annoying, right? Things that I can just really do easily in the UK. There's all these benefits to Dubai, but I'm like, you quickly see, okay, this is kind of annoying. This is kind of annoying. Oh, this would be much easier to do when I'm in England. There's certain things I wait to do until I'm back visiting the UK, and then I do those bits of my business.
Yeah.
And I think people just don't recognize that very much with this US as well. One of the best things it has going for it is its physical geography.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a massive benefit. It's so fortunate, and people don't recognize it. It's like, let's just destroy it.
There are so many other aspects there, like, because like I think England used to have a really homely feel, that was captured in Harry Potter.
It does. Comparatively
in some places, but like, the sort of like the age of the place gives it a sort of dignity and allows you to feel like you belong. Where in America, there's definitely that's lacking.
Yes.
It doesn't have the sort of dignity that England had.
The architecture.
And so, the architecture and the sort of, the kinds of chairs, the cultural particulars of being in Britain. Like, we could really quite play that up. If we were proud of being British and proud of our heritage, we would play that up a bit and make it appealing to those people who liked Harry Potter, basically. And we'd be able to attract talent, entrepreneurialism, things like that. But we just don't do any of that. We're not proud of any of our achievements. We're not proud of our history. We're not proud of ourselves. And we're just in this unbelievable slump at the moment. I just can't get over why we're just allowing this to happen. It's not necessary, but the decline is a choice. We could choose otherwise. We're just incapable of it.
Yeah, there needs to be a shot of optimism. Carl, if you got some time, I want to shift gears away from politics.
I'd love to.
For a little bit, yeah. I actually want to talk to you a little bit about, I know how long have you been married for?
8 years now, I think.
8 years, and you've got 4 kids?
Yes.
Amazing. Well, firstly, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Because you don't hear that often these days. particularly in the UK. People have bigger families in America,
Mm.
maybe because there's more like Christian conservatives, but in the UK, even having 4 children, that's like,
It is,
Yeah,
Well, I do get that from people. But it's usually 2 kids.
yeah. It seems like there's if you walk around, it seems like there's a 2-child policy.
Yeah.
Like,
The China implementation.
Yeah. I'm like, are you allowed more than 2? It doesn't look like it.
And the thing is, as well, people don't understand that like actually having more kids makes it easier for you because they like playing with themselves, right? They rely on you less for attention, which is not that I don't like giving my kids attention or anything, but it just means that it's not as difficult as you would think it is. And my oldest is 14, then 9, then 3, then 2, and so for long periods of time it was just the 2. It was more difficult with just the 2 than with the 3 or the 4 because the older ones can help with the younger ones as well. So it's actually you're kind of making your life more difficult by only having the 2, and you don't even realize it. You think, oh, I've only got 2 eyes.
I'm the youngest of 5, and I've never had a babysitter.
There we go.
In my life,
exactly. Yeah, we've never had to get a babysitter. Anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk, because this is a whole area where, again, things in the West are not trending in a good direction.
No.
Whether you're talking marriage rates,
Yeah.
or you're talking birth rates, they are, not disconnected. Just male-female relationships,
Yeah.
all of this stuff is, again, is it as bad as it may look on the internet? Probably not, but even by just hard data, things are not trending in a good direction. People are getting married later than ever and lower numbers than ever. People are having fewer children than ever. Every single developed country in the world, except Israel, has below replacement birth rate. The only thing keeping the numbers up is immigration and people living a long time. And it just seems very disordered and chaotic, and it seems like young men in particular are not happy with it, and young women are disillusioned and unhappy.
They're all on antidepressants.
Struggling. Yep. Young men are struggling. You hear talk of crisis of masculinity. Where do we even start with this, man? Like, what do you think is going on?
Would you like an extreme solution to all of this?
Give me. All right, let's go with the extreme solution to begin with.
Ban birth control. That's what it requires.
Yeah.
All of this is a product of birth control. If we can have sex without the consequences of having sex, then all of this follows.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we should ban birth control, but that's the only way I think it gets solved.
That was the atom bomb.
Yeah, it really was.
Downstream
And
from that, yeah.
and it was done for very liberal reasons, which I'm sure seemed like a good idea in the 60s and 70s. But look where we are now. If young women can have sex and young men can have sex with whoever they want without any consequences, then what's the incentive to be in a relationship?
Yeah. These are the downstream consequences that people, I believe, truly don't see in the moment. I think we live in a really interesting time where we're, 60 years past the sexual revolution or so?
Yeah, about
60 years exactly. And obviously I was not alive.
Yeah, 3 generations in, and look at how it's going.
I wasn't alive during the 60s, but from what I can gather, people had certain expectations and predictions around that. And we're now dealing with a lot of fallout and unforeseen consequences. One of the ones that was most interesting to me is to learn that actually when the pill came out, people thought that the number of unplanned pregnancies would decrease, and it increased.
Yeah.
Which
the abortion should go down, right?
Yes, all these things went up.
Yeah.
People probably thought, oh yeah, people will be happier. Maybe women in particular will be happier, at least in the way that they subjectively define it. And that seems to be going very much in the opposite direction. And have there been, sure, in some ways, yes, of course, there have been benefits, at least if you're looking through an economic lens or a GDP lens
it's
a
been
pure
great
freedom type of lens.
Yeah, great for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Double the workforce, brilliant. Half the wages.
Yeah, and now even people. What's interesting is how it impacts even people who are more traditionalist. So, say you are a woman who would like to honestly prioritize being a mother and being a wife and being a homemaker, and now you feel like, okay, yeah, you now have to work because unless the man is earning much far above. If you want to have a good lifestyle, unless the man is a high earner, then he's not going to be able to support you off a single income. And even a man who's like, oh yeah, I would prefer a more traditional dynamic, even if you want that, it's harder to attain now than it was in the past. So it's
not good, is it?
No, it's
making people miserable. It's genuinely making people miserable. Like,
and I think the thing is, I think it's also, I think people who have been, God bless them, people who have been married and sort of out of that world for even 10 plus years, let alone 20 plus years, I think in general they massively underestimate what young people are dealing with right now, right? Because they just have this mentality, oh, well, I've been married 40 years and I just did this and it worked fine. And it's like, even in the last 10 years, you don't realize how much stuff
dating apps. I'm so not envious of young people.
Dude, even when I was 20, I'm 38.
Yeah.
Even in my mid 20s, like it was dorks who were on dating apps.
Really?
Like
Well, yeah, I suppose it would.
The initial idea of like online dating, it was like
nerd.
It was really nerdy, right? It was like, what's wrong with you, bro? Like you're on the internet, like
can't you just go to a bar?
And now majority of relationships start online now. Like it's totally. Totally flipped.
I saw a graph about this because it used to be through like social interactions, so it'd be family and friends, like, oh, my cousin has brought a girl to a party that, and, you'd meet and hang out and stuff like that. But people are socializing a lot less like that. So now it's just like internet dating has gone up because it's just, okay, well, I'll just have to find a rando out of, with no connection. Because, if you're at a party, it's not necessarily like a romantic thing. So you're relaxed, right? You talk to this person, oh, yeah. Oh, do you want to grab a beer maybe? Because you thought, oh, I quite like them. They seem quite like you. Why don't we go out and hang out sometime? It's a totally different environment. But if you think about like, okay, I'm on a dating app. I'm here expressly for romance, allegedly, right? Theoretically. So like the guards are already up, It's sort of like, okay, well, this is more like contractual at this point. Whereas when you were at a party, you just happened to click with someone and you got on with someone. You weren't looking for that when you were there, So it's the entire sort of paradigm of male-female relationships is kind of different in the way that it forms. And that's got to have some knock-on effect to the way, if you look at like, marriage rates, how long relationships last, how happy people are, it's obviously having some effect.
It's having a massive effect. And it's one of those things where very few people speak about it openly and honestly. And so people are not willing to sort of like diagnose, let alone potentially prescribe decent solutions, because I think the world of, dating, sex relationships, marriage, all of that stuff, like, it's quite private. It's kind of at least supposed to be. And so what I actually see happening, and this is happening and people might not even really be aware of it, is there is a bizarre, it's resulting in a shift towards what is essentially soft polygamy.
Interesting.
Particularly being driven through these apps. Okay? Because it's a very, very small pool of men that are getting all the... So if people are meeting through friends, family, churches, in the real world, out and about, it's actually kind of more... It's more egalitarian in a way. Because someone might be a guy who's not like... If you saw his 3 or 4 pictures on an app, he doesn't look like a stud or whatever, or maybe he's like a bit short. So like women will go on these apps and like they'll set their filters to 6 foot plus and so on. So they're already cutting out 90%. Right? They're setting like very specific filters and so on. So that's all they even see. Whereas in the real world, if those people met and there's the charm and the charisma and the body language and the verbal communication skills, whereas this, it's immediately just visual, still visual, right? So men. I remember, and because they keep stats on all this stuff. I think on these apps, like men swipe yes something like 50% of the time. On 50% of the women, men are like, yeah, I'd be interested in chatting.
The women's like 10%.
I think under. less.
Really?
I think it's 3 to 4%.
Jesus.
Okay, so women are rejecting 96, 97% of guys, whereas men are saying yes 50% of the time. And you can imagine that 3 to 4% for the women is pretty much all the same guys.
Yeah.
So you have some guys who are just like, maybe they're just very good looking, particularly they're tall and good looking.
Sure.
And they can just clean up.
Yeah.
Right? So they might be dating like, and people are like, why won't these men commit? I'm like, he's not committing because he's got 10 women.
And also, it's totally anonymous as well.
It's totally anonymous.
Like it's a one-to-one.
Yes.
Because in any other social circumstance, the women would know each other,
Yes.
so they would communicate. You would be, seen driving to their house or something like that. It was like, he's a good, so there'd be a stigma. You'd be in trouble.
There'd even be a stigma with the man.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There'd be a stigma for both parties, right? And he's seeing lots of girls. So avoid him. He's not trustworthy. Blah blah. But because it's all remote, abstract, anonymized on these apps, these women have no idea the other women exist. No one knows, and so you are.
They're making websites and forums for women to work out when they're dating the same guy.
Really?
Yeah.
God.
And this, this is what I mean. Like, it's so bizarre, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like this is what is happening. So you're actually moving more towards like you want to talk super traditional model of like you might just have this guy who's like, okay, like the women are saying they have all these quite often quite shallow or materialistic things that they want, and only 2% of the male population is meeting those. And so those guys are lots of guys. There's lots of guys out there who are like, man, I can't even get a date. Like, or I've been on my guy might even be a decent looking guy, but he's 5'7", and he's not like stunningly good looking or super rich or famous or anything. And on these, like in the real world, he'd probably be fine.
Yeah.
But on these apps, it's just like, boy, it's really rough. And then so there's this like massive skew that's happening, and then you hear women's frustrations, and no one tells them this, but when they're frustrated, I'm like, it's because you're literally the guys you're most attracted to, like who meet these things, they will not. Why won't they commit? It's like he won't commit because
you're giving him the milk for free.
Yes, and he has so many
choices
and options, and like apart from the sort of quote unquote red pill, like almost no one really talks about this because it's like some people either just don't know and aren't aware, or they kind of don't. It's a bit of an ugly reality of what's really going on. And in the absence, again, furthermore, in the absence of any type of like, sort of core morality or faith or even guidance, under the consent-based morality, there's nothing wrong with what any of these people are doing, right? Why shouldn't that guy do that? You can come up with a very... You can go back to the Bible. Oh, Solomon had 1,000 wives. Like David had multiple wives.
But what obligation does he have to you to tell you that he's dating these other girls as well?
He doesn't.
Like, exactly. Why would he? Where would it come from?
And a remarkable number of women are totally fine with it.
Yeah.
That's another sort of those ugly truths where someone might think, oh, like no woman would be okay with that. I'm like, actually, you'll be surprised with how many are.
Think about women's psychology when it comes to sex compared to men's. For men, if you haven't had sex with a woman, that's a bad thing for women, but for men, the fewer partners, the better.
Yes.
I mean, women will literally insult men for being virgins.
Virgin, yeah.
And it's like, so that implies that if you haven't had a significant number of partners...
Incel now.
Yeah, exactly, incel, yeah. Now, if you haven't had a significant number of partners, you're an inferior man. Mm. And that's the way women look at sex. And it's like, okay, that's not the same as the way men look at sex at all. It's the total opposite. So... But I just want to say, right, as a very average-looking guy, I've had loads of girlfriends. Yeah. So for those guys who are worried about it, just be a bit more charismatic. Work on your pattern.
Get offline. I think people need to obviously self-improve.
Sure.
And play to their strengths. Yeah. Right? Like if you're not someone who's like, particularly as a man, like if you're not a man who's like obviously just like, wow, that guy's a stud. Where someone would just see a photo of you and be like, oh wow, right?
I'm that guy.
If you're not in that, like I think guys need to just don't rely on these apps.
Your personality does 90% of the work, I promise.
Yeah, but in the real world,
not on the apps.
That opportunity can come if it's just like a catalog of like yes, no, yes, no, yes. No. And what it also does is it massively inflates egos.
Oh God, yeah.
It massively inflates ego. So like I said, men are swiping yes on 50% of women. So there are many women out there who think, oh, okay, why? You must see these videos of like the crazy standards, insane standards. You have a woman who's like moderately attractive.
Yeah.
And the standards are just like huge. And why? It's because there's so much attention coming through social media, coming through these apps. It's like they think, hey, I've got 500 guys.
I must be a 7 or an 8 or maybe even more, you know?
Yeah. It's a real mess, man. But last point on this, though, is because I think that actually is really existential with it, is the fact that, I mean, people are not, I don't want to say people are not coupling up and having children, because they are still by
just
the
at
millions.
a much lower rate.
Yeah, but a much, much, much lower rate. And
to me, if you think back to like, the sort of when our granddads were young, every single man was married.
Yes.
Every single man had
If I
kids.
were born a few decades earlier,
yeah,
I would be married with at least 5 kids by now.
Exactly. Right. I married at 36, I think it was.
Yeah.
So, I married late, but that, my dad marries at 21. My granddad probably married by the time he was 18. We take it for granted that the world is so much better, but like no men had this problem 100 years ago. No. This just didn't exist. It couldn't exist. Every man was married. Yes.
So beyond banning birth control,
that is the ultimate root cause of why this has been allowed to happen. I don't think banning birth control is something can happen.
Yeah.
I think no one would ever vote for it. It's outrageous, etc., etc.
What do you think about marriage and or having children being incentivized by the state or government in some way?
I think it's inevitable. I mean, what if it doesn't happen naturally anymore because it's being interrupted by scientific procedures? Then we have to, because it's just the case that you are a part of your civilization and that you carry your civilization with you through your life. And part of that, because the civilization you were born into, you didn't choose it, but you were given lots of good things that nurtured you through your life. You were given safety, protection, health, love, care, and a suite of sort of cultural attributes that are intrinsically beneficial to you, whether you understand, even see them or not. You do have an obligation to pass that on. You aren't allowed to just say, well, no, this ends with me and I'm going to end my own bloodline. It's like, no, that's very selfish. That's taking advantage of a lot of different kinds of unpaid labor that people before you have put in, and just say, yeah, so I'm not going to pass that along. It's like, no, I think we do have a moral obligation to pass that along, actually. I think if people were educated to understand themselves as part of a civilization, that they were responsible for curating, right? I think a lot of people would want to take a lot better care of the country if they really thought of themselves being like, no, I'm a part of the great chain of being here, and I don't want my distant ancestors or descendants to think ill of me for being lazy and fat and selfish, actually. But at the moment, people are lazy, fat and selfish when it comes to like mortgaging off the future in debt and various other ways, and it's like we're creating problems for people who come after us, and they're not going to be thankful for it. They're going to hate us. In the same way many Zoomers now hate the Boomers. Yes. They genuinely hate them. You selfish bastards. Yeah. Why have you left me with all this?
Yeah, there's a real absence of generational thinking as well.
Yeah.
That really hit me. It was 2 weeks ago. It was my mom's 70th birthday, and we threw a 1 week celebration for her, essentially. And so my entire family came together. So all 5 of the kids, all 10 of my nieces and nephews, in-laws. So just in one house, we had 23 people in one house, and then other people came over the weekend. And my parents are now 70 and 78, and they've got 10 grandkids, Lord willing, more to come. And people always comment on how youthful and happy my parents look, given their age. And it really strikes me when you see the generational element of it, because I think people forget that if you willingly opt to not ever be a parent, I say this as someone who's not yet married with kids, but absolutely plans to be, you're also saying no to ever being a grandparent.
Yeah.
And I think people forget even that. Like, I think people are so stuck in the moment and the short-term thinking that they don't see. So I imagine in an alternate universe, a version of my father who just decided to stay a bachelor.
Right.
And all of that we were there 2 weeks ago, 20 plus people, none of that now exists. So he would be a 78-year-old doctor who, with a lot of money in the bank, but no wife, no kids, no grandkids, like all of
No
these
one to
things.
spend it on.
Yeah, all of these things that give him joy and support and meaning and purpose and actually keep him very youthful and very active physically and mentally, all of that is just gone. And I think if more people perhaps even saw that and really thought about it, it would give a little bit of a kick to be, like as you were speaking, I was thinking, like obviously, I have to have children and pass that down, right? Like, sure, like, I've left that million reasons, like, relatively late for something compared to some people. But, I
do wish I'd done it.
I absolutely have that desire. Yeah. And I also know that given the very weird path I've taken in life with my career and so on, it wasn't until my mid 30s where I even was like, okay, I'm even stable.
Yeah. But
enough to, because with me, this is, sorry, man. Like,
that's all right.
Just to, because I'm sure there'll be people just for anyone who might even be curious with me. It's because in my mid 20s I took this weird path to I left my job and I was like I became a full-time rapper. I'm just traveling like crazy, whatever. With me it was also just like it's not even like responsible for me to drag another person through this. Like for this time period, I need to just have the free. I can't have dependence. Number one, I can't financially even support them right now. But also I need to be able to, I'm every day I'm in a different city. Even with, a girlfriend I may have had at the time, it's like, this is very difficult for her because I'm not even, I have to do this. Like this is, and the truth is, had I taken that different path, I'm sure my life would look fine, but it would look very different. And I'm sure actually the vast majority of people who now know me probably wouldn't. Yeah. Because I would be more
a different man in a different time.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm that. Who's to say which is better or worse? Yeah. But it would have just looked different. Anyway, I feel like I've been No.
It's totally fine. And I tell you, my dad's side of the family, both my parents, one of 6. Mm-hmm. My dad's side of the family never was big on family get-togethers. Okay. They're a lot more reserved. But my mum's side of the family always had massive family get-togethers. So I've got like 20-something cousins, and 6 or 5 aunts and uncles.
56.
yeah. But the point is, like when you were saying that was just a massive household, man, that was all the time when I was young, because my dad being in the RAF, just 3 or 4 times a year we'd come back to my nan's house on my mum's side. Just because it was the only sort of anchor in Britain that we'd have from Germany. And so we'd come back and everyone would come over and it would just be amazing, And the thing is, I'd see my nan and granddad essentially presiding over this as the sort of matriarch and patriarch of this giant brood. And it's like, look, this is their victory, man. This is their win. This is their, and they obviously they were just happy as anything that everyone was round, and they'd be thrilled. And I don't even know what they would have done had they'd just taken a different life. I wouldn't want for myself... I want that in the future. Yeah. I want that,
Yeah. So. Yeah. I think a lot of people, young people in particular, think about the first half of life, but not the second half.
100%. They don't realize that they're going to move through stations in their life. At some point, like, okay, you're young, you're successful, you're handsome, you're beautiful, you can do whatever you want, but that doesn't last forever. And you need to put the roots down now, get because what you want to build into the next stage of your life, and you'll get there. Whether you like it or not, your looks will fade, your hair will grey, you'll get there whether you like it or not. Don't be like Madonna, don't end up looking like a plastic Boggendorf mask, like it's freakish. It's freakish. Yeah. No one looks at Madonna with envy. Mm-hmm. Everyone's like, oh, okay, granny, but she isn't a granny, she doesn't have a brood to look after. You'll move into the sort of matriarch or patriarch role, whether you like it or not, and it's whether it suits you or not, right? And if you've got a family, it will suit you. And everyone will be thrilled to see you all the time, and your life will be very rich. And I can see it in my mum, because me and my sister, we didn't have kids until we were almost 40, not together, obviously, separately. Just realised the way that sounds. Neither of us had a family with our separate partners until I was I think it was 36, something like that. And the same with my sister, she was a couple of years younger than me. She was about late 30s. And so my mum and dad had basically resigned themselves to not being grandparents. And then suddenly now they've got like 6, Amazing. And so it's just like, my mum is the happiest woman on earth. She's the happiest woman on earth. And you think, okay, you know, oh, I was going to deny that to her. You know, I've got this one picture where she's holding my youngest daughter, who's nearly 2 now, and she's just smooching her against her face with a smile. That would not have been possible had, you know, that wouldn't have happened. And the joy that my mum feels, I would have denied that to her by not going down the correct route for a man's life. Yeah. And I was thinking, God, it could have been so easy that I didn't as well. Yes. I could so easily have not done it. And I'm so glad I did.
Especially someone who works in the field that you do.
Yeah, successful, I could have just been whatever, but I'm so glad I did. And my life is so much richer for it. So much richer for it. I'd never go back. Like, if someone's like, oh, if you travel back in time, so why would I want to travel back in time? You know, I wouldn't have my kids, and couldn't do it.
I love that, man. Carl, that's inspiring, and I think that's a wonderful place to end, man. I love conversations with you, man. You're one of those guys I could literally just sit here all day and we could just...
You know, you're always welcome, man. No doubt. It's always a pleasure to have you.
I appreciate it. And thank you for letting me use this beautiful studio.
Thank you.